Hello, folks. It's good to see you again on our YouTube sharing. This afternoon, we will be giving you the start of the complete discussion on the revised corporation law. A couple of months ago, we already uploaded all the changes under the revised corporation law of 2019. And so you already got an idea of exactly what changes have been made on the corporation law. Uh, However, if you are not familiar yet with the structure of corporations, and we gave you only the changes, you wouldn't have the complete picture of what corporation is all about. And so now we're back to help you understand what the entire corporation is all about. And there are certain very interesting topics that I found out when I was finalizing this little sharing with you. All along, I have always smiled at the discussion on what is a corporation, an artificial being, created by operation of law with the rights of succession and the powers, attributes, and properties authorized by law or incident to its existence. And somehow it gets to be very boring to be able to hear that. And then you already know what's next, the separate entity theory and the doctrine of piercing the veil of corporate virginity. That's what we call them. But actually, the correct word is piercing the veil of corporate entity. And so I have always said that it's not really something that is worthwhile even talking about. But because I had to start with that kind of discussion to introduce corporation, I started just reading a little bit, and I was surprised that my initial impression that this is too petty an issue is not really petty at all. For example, sometime in the 1800s in England, the concept of corporation started where it says that the stockholder, owner, and the corporation are two separate entities before the law. That the stockholder owner is a natural person, and when he organizes a corporation, that corporation becomes a separate and distinct legal entity, principally to serve as vehicle for conducting business. That was easy until you said, why did they have to organize a corporation? And then the concept came in that it is difficult to mobilize entrepreneurial capital because people are afraid that if you start a business, that if your business should succeed, that's fine, you get a lot of wealth. But the chances of your succeeding is also very risky. There's a danger of losing money. And when you lose money, you don't only lose the capital that you have put up in the business, you could have even incurred obligations that would extend to your personal assets in the same light of the obligation of a general partner in a general co-partnership. And so people are very scared to get into the business that are new, pioneering, and tested. So what is the biggest investment they would make? They will buy land, real estate, or they'll go to the bank and just put that in safety placements like time deposits. And so the exercise of entrepreneurship, the opportunity for people who have money and intellectual imagination to create new ventures, the way, for example, Ford started with the automobile in the United States, or other inventions that have been made, like Bill Gates on computers. These were not areas where people would normally be comfortable with if they would risk their savings and finally lose everything and they become poor again. So they would rather not go into business because of the fear of the foreclosure proceedings on their obligations. And so in England in the 1800s, they came up with the mechanism that says that, well, we can give a legal creation for you. That when you go into the business, you put money there, you run your business through that mechanism that we will call a corporation. And you will only be liable to the extent of whatever capital you put in that corporation. That after that capital is wiped out. For example, because you lost money and you owe people, creditors, some money, the assets of the corporation that you contributed and perhaps you even earned along the way will only be the subject matter of any collection efforts from your creditors. That your properties that you did not put up in the business are already protected from attachment and foreclosure. And so that was how the corporation started. But later on, I'll tell you that the bankers' creditors are able to go around that particular limitation. And so the corporation somehow evolved as a business entity, no longer functioning based on its original purpose of limited liability, although the limited liability continues to be there at least in paper. But somewhere along the line, the beauty about the concept of corporate succession came into being. More so because right now, the life of a corporation has become now perpetual. The 50-year limit that was in the original version of the corporation code has been amended to allow a corporation, once registered, to have a perpetual life, unless the shareholders should amend their articles of incorporation and shorten the life of the corporation. That is how they can cut the life. And so without much ado, let us now go ahead and take a look at our first portion. We have a number of modules, and I have about 2 modules available now. We will upload this one after the other. We will not run a continuous flow, otherwise we might run out of time by about 2.5 to 3 hours to 4 hours. No. Well, based on the suggestion of so many of our friends, they said in Bisquera, anyway, we already know you. You don't have to go into the details of your credentials. So I just want, they said, you just post your academics and we will look at them. You post your business management lineup and of course your expertise in the law profession. And that's good enough. He said that we already know you. Well, at least I can say I am Dean Joe-Santos Balagtas Bisquera, the incumbent Dean of the College of Law of the University of Manila. And so, without much ado, we now go into our supposed to be covering sheet. We will be covering the revised corporation code under Republic Act 11232, but there are portions of the original corporation code of February 23, February 23, 2019 is the date that Republic Act 11232, the revised corporation code, became effective. But the revised corporation code did not amend all the provisions of the corporation code of 1980, and we will continue to use them as they become relevant. Our first subject matter will be dealing with the general provisions, the definition and classification of corporations. We will touch here on the definition of the corporation, and here we will talk about the separate entity theory and the piercing of the corporate veil. We will talk about the classes of corporation, corporations by special law or charter, corporators, incorporators, stockholders, and the classification of shares. And we will wind up the first discussion on founder shares, redeemable shares, and treasury shares. And that allows us to cut our upload for the first presentation, and if we find time now or a few days from now, we will go to the second module, which is on the topic of incorporation, where we will talk about the number and qualification of stockholders. We will touch on the one-man corporation, one of the latest and the newest feature of the revised corporation code. However, because we are already talking about one-man corporation, we will even cover the so-called corporation sole and corporation aggregate that refers to religious organizations. So we will cover that long portion on one-man corporation and then the religious one-man corporations or corporation sole. Then we go to the corporate term, which has now been extended to a perpetual life of the corporation. We'll go to the minimum capital stock, and there is no minimum for purposes of starting your corporation. It is just in the area where you increase your authorized capital stock, then that you have to follow the 25% rule on subscription and the 25% on the fully paid on the subscription. Then finally, the contents of articles of incorporation. You will notice those provisions that have been affected by the revised corporation code have green shades here, while number 13, which is the contents of the articles of incorporation, is not colored because they are the provisions where we did not have significant changes in the corporation code. If you notice in the first portion, the general provisions, definitions, and classification, there is almost minimal, if ever, changes. And so we go back to exactly what it is all about at the very start of the corporation code. So without much ado, let's now go to our first get-together, the general provisions, definition, and classification. Well, let's get away with Section 2 of our corporation code. It says that a corporation is an artificial being created by operation of law, having the right of succession and the powers, attributes, and properties expressly authorized by law or incident to its existence. The significant things I'd like you to call attention to would be a corporation is an artificial being as distinguished from a natural person like you and me. It's an artificial person under the law, and so that therefore it has no physical existence, but it is a legal personality before the law. The typical private corporations are organized by operation of law. Private corporations do not get to be organized by passing a charter or a what you call this a special law by Congress. That will be very messy because there will be confusion on where really is the power of a private corporation coming from. And so the corporation code becomes the basis of organizing a corporation. It has its set of provisions to let stockholders get to follow in order to organize a privately owned private corporation. I'd like to call your attention to the right of succession, because when you have a perpetual life existence of a corporation, the concept of succession becomes very significant. Of course, we will have a section on the powers, attributes, and properties of the corporation after these 2 or 3 modules. I'd like to share with you this fundamental concept now, where when you talk about a person building up his wealth, building up his physical and financial resources, he has actually 3 venues. He can either be an employee in an employer-employee relationship. He can practice his profession like a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a CPA, where he does not have a real superior or boss, but he services directly his clientele. These are the two very popular ways of earning money. But there is a third one, and that is you build up wealth by entering into business. And the concept of business we will explain in a little while. But business is the means by which you are able to grow your wealth. Yan ang talagang pwedeng magpayaman sa iyo. Either your forebears, your grandparents, your parents involved themselves in business and were able to save money and properties, and they passed on those properties to you under the regime of ancestral inheritance. Or you yourself, with or without any inheritance, could have saved enough money out of your being an employee or a professional, and having acquired your money, you decided to also enter into business. And so you start buying and selling, and across the transactions, and you spend over the days, the weeks, the months, the years, you're able to also save a lot of money. And so you have now your self-acquired resources. So business is the key to becoming wealthy. It is not being employed, or it is not practicing the profession. Let's look at the self-acquired resources. No? In other words, we already know where the ancestral inheritance is coming from. Under the law on succession or inheritance, you essentially, under the so-called pyramidal family tree, you're able to expect something from your parents and your grandparents. But let us talk about the self-acquired resources. Probably you were born, you became a teenager, you were studying, you almost had nothing except your underwears, a couple of pair of pants, a pair of shirts, you may even have your own sunglasses. But other than that, you have nothing, you are dependent on your parents for your daily and weekly allowances. After that, you finish your course, and you started applying with organizations, and the first level way of earning your self-acquired resource is to be an employee. Where being an employee, you are at the service of an employer, and if you sustain your life, you get married, you build your family, and you continue to be an employee, of course you get promoted along the way because of your experiences earned over the years with the same company or other companies. Then you're able to have a life for your family that is sufficient in food. You have a place to live, either rented or probably purchased. And then you are able to provide clothing for your family, and you're able to send your children to school. And so being an employee is not very bad. It's just that you are not able to build up so much of your self-acquired resources in such a way that you can really live very comfortably. Those who move into the professions like the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, the architects, the CPAs, name it, they do have special skills. And these special skills were not only learned in school, they were tested by the government in terms of minimum competencies under the Professional Regulations Commission, or if you are in the law profession, tested by the Supreme Court through the bar examination. And if you are a normally progressive professional, you can probably have a better life than a regular employee because you are already partly controlling your fees, and you can have better fees and lower costs and expenses depending upon how your customers are looking at you. And so with your special knowledge and in the practice of your profession, you may have a comfortable life. the benchmark of which is you might be able to buy a respectable house and lot in a good subdivision, and you can have a car or a little over one or two cars, and perhaps your children are able to go to the better schools like UP, De La Salle, Ateneo, where you have to spend a little money in order to give them education. But the third way of building up your wealth through self-acquired resources is to go into business. The business of buying, selling, buying, and selling. You buy the commodity that you want to sell, then you sell it at a higher price. So the mechanism is you buy cheap, you sell more. You buy cheap, you sell more. And as you repeat the same process all over again, you're able to build up what is called a spread or a profit. And when you accumulate those profits, it is possible that initially while your income, your total gross income may not be as small, as big, probably even smaller than an employee or a professional. But over a period of time, you build up clientele. And as you are able to master your business model, you are able to get expertise in your marketing and manufacturing processes using the fundamentals of, for example, the learning curve. That the more you do a thing, the more you learn. The more you manufacture a product, the more you become efficient on it, and it becomes cost effective for you, that you're able to sell at the same good price, but you're able to lower the cost because of your experience factor called the learning curve. And you scan the environment. This is where you use a strategy. That's why you have strategic creativity versus opportunity. And along the way, this is where the rich people really belong to. And if you mention, for example, the richest man in the Philippines, Henry C., so he has already passed away and has given his SM empire to his children. But somewhere along the line, with the buy and sell mechanism that started with this Schumer shoes, and move over to his what do you call this? His mega malls, and now his DMC, his SM homes, where he's building up. His companies are building up condominiums for sale. He's able to make millions for himself and his family. And that is followed very closely by John Gokongwei, who started only selling used tires in Cebu, to die as a very rich man, dealing with products that are equally competing with SM, including his own malls. And then you have people like David Consunhi. He started struggling as a contractor until he ended up being the #1 construction company in the Philippines, beating the original leaders, Atlantic Gulf and Pacific Company, and engineering equipment, even if they're still around. And you have a lot of other millionaires. Of course, we know Tony Kachong, who started only with an ice cream parlor that families would visit on weekends, until he finally decided to move out, to move a little more from ice cream to a foreign sourced product, which is hamburger. And so Jollibee was born. And before you know it, Jollibee is the byword in Philippine fast food. But they have also crossed the boundary of the Philippines to end up in a lot of countries, including the United States and the Middle East, where the bulk of their customers are the migrant Filipinos. And so you have Jollibee sounding it out and giving a run for the money against the supposedly worldwide leader, which is McDonald's. Another one that is very interesting is, of course, in the chicken business. hawak-hawak ng KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken worldwide. But biglang pumasok ang ibang mechanism, biglang nagkaroon ng mga chicken houses like Baliwag Chicken, and the other chicken brands. No? Of course, a pillar in its own right is Max Fried Chicken that started after the war, catering to the American soldiers after the war, and built up a reputation for being a fried chicken that tastes differently. And so moving on to some other areas, we say now that, in the area of going into business, business has a lot of contribution to society, especially when the areas where a businessman gets in are pioneering their new products, new services. They're innovative. They come up with new ideas on how to find their customers and how to service their customers. And they are very competitive businesses. Obviously, in the area of business, there will always be competition. And in the competition, you will have winners and you'll have losers. To the winners and the losers, to your contribution to society, especially the winners will be in the national productivity measured by GNP. Those who build up their business as winners are able to add to the finished products that are produced by the Republic of the Philippines. Obviously, the successful businesses become a major source of employment, so that those Filipinos who prefer to be simply at the lower level of employees would find the businesses as their destination for employment. Also, with the expansion of business, including the employment of workers, there will be now a build-up of the national funds by the by the taxes that are collected from these taxable activities that are able to provide the infrastructure funds to build up the roads, bridges, and all the infrastructure that will even make our economy more competitive by providing the transportation and road networks to move our products and services. And finally, the concept of business allows the mobilization of society and the component of economics and society so that the nation's resources are used more extensively rather than they become idle properties. Just to give you an idea of how business gets to evolve, the state needs to mobilize the social and economic forces to accelerate growth. And there is President Duterte hoping that the production of excess goods for domestic consumption and for exports, more so before and hopefully after this COVID pandemic. That is the singular key to generating earnings, not only for our individual households, but for the entire economy, so that the people can acquire more disposable incomes for higher standard of living and prosperity at the grassroots. So a desirable national development policy is the build-up of businesses that are Filipino, pioneering, innovative, and competitive. The wealth in the hands of business entrepreneurs is a huge resource. Let me just take a look at that. Let us move this particular picture a little here and make it a little smaller so that you're able to watch what we're trying to say. And we say now here, the wealth in the hands of the businessman entrepreneurs is a huge resource to mobilize the people's productivity through new business ventures consisting of pioneering, innovative, and competitive undertakings. And so you have the faces of three of our millionaires in the Philippines. You may not readily recognize them, and there is their wealth, their ancestral inheritance, and their self-acquired resources that will form the money for capital investment so that there will be more wealth for themselves and for the people who work for them. Just for your curiosity, in the triumvirate on the lower right-hand side is that wonderful man, John Gokongwei of Cebu Pacific, and JG Summit, and all the empire that he has. Of course, in the middle is a caricature of Mr. SM himself, Henry C. And I don't know whether you recognize he is not very fond of publicity. Neither are the two anyway. But he is the least probably publicized, and his picture is in the left side of the triumvirate. I met him personally when I was doing my rehabilitation at the Makati Medical Center. I was wondering who this humble-looking old gentleman who was on the treadmill wearing a very unassuming pair of short pants that probably looks even cheaper than what you can buy in Baclaran or Divisoria, you know. And he looked very humble, although he was tall. Until I finally have the occasion to learn that that person on the treadmill happens to be the elder brother of my own MBA professor at UP. He is millionaire David Consinhi of the MCI. And somewhere along the line, because we always see each other, we finally got ourselves introduced. He was very proud to meet another product of the University of the Philippines, and I was also a professor. He knew that. And we had a lot of fun. It's too bad I did not have a chance to meet him before he died, but he's a very humble man, and he was even telling me on the side how started really hard up with his construction company until little by little, they grew. And so in the hands of people like them, you know, the wealth of the nation is in their hands, and if they release their money to become capital investment, their objective is, of course, to make more wealth for themselves and their families and their companies. But likewise, they will also be contributing to the well-being of the nation because they're able to provide jobs to people, they're able to create goods and services that the country can produce and sell. Having identified the power center of wealth and business, they have also learned, you know, not only them, but in those who coming from other countries, that while the build-up of more wealth through these business ventures can attract businesses to open up, the entrepreneurs concerned, they're concerned, you know, actually their fear is of losing their entire wealth on account of business failure, and that is a major stumbling block to aggressive national resource mobilization. For as long as our, what we call this businessman, who essentially control the wealth of the nation, are a little more careful in releasing their money because they're scared to lose also whatever they have earned, then that can also slow down progress. That can slow down the opening of industries and companies within those industries, and it will slow down also the creation of jobs and business opportunities for other people. And so the state created the corporation. That is when the corporation came into being as a legal economic mechanism to build the debt, to limit the debt that a businessman entrepreneur will pay for when he ventures into pioneering undertakings but suffered a loss with the threat of bankruptcy. In other words, the corporation was built to for the government to tell our businessmen that do not be afraid to lose your entire wealth if you go into business, because we will give you a legal economic entity that we will call a corporation. And if you contribute money and use that corporation for business while you're running it, that corporation has a separate legal personality. And it can go into business, it can enter into contracts, it can buy, it can sell, it can acquire properties. But in the event, just in the event, for unfortunate event, that you suffer a loss and the accumulation of the losses led you to see that the obligations of that corporation has gotten to be more than its assets and therefore it is bankrupt, the deficiency in the obligation will stop right there. It will not cross the boundary to try to reach out to your personal wealth, because you may have other funds that are invested also in other businesses, and those other businesses may be making money. And so if you lose money in one, there is a limit to your obligation, and that is only to the extent of what that corporation owns, because it is actually a separate entity from your personality. Here is, for instance, a way to describe the more integrated view of that particular thing. You have, of course, the government through the Securities and Exchange Commission that opens up and recognizes and registers corporations precisely to be the main vehicle for doing business. And so on the right side is the government effort to help the businessman manage his risk. On the left side is the bulk of the wealth of the nation in the private sector, controlled by our businessman investor. And somewhere along the line, their propensity to earn more wealth encourage them to enter into specific businesses where they felt they will make more money. And so they get a portion of their wealth, invest it in the corporation that they organize under SEC, and the money that they contributed is what we call equity funds or owner's capital. Traditionally, a corporation under logical banking and financial rules would allow a capitalization where 40% are coming from the owners and 60% can be borrowed from the creditor banks. And so continuing now, here is the second portion of the capitalization of a company. They go to the banking sector, in this case BDO, and BDO was willing to pass on, 60% of the capitalization to make it total funds of 100%. And here is where the service of the government comes in. It says that since you organize a corporation, and this corporation on its own as a separate entity will borrow money from the creditor banks, the creditor banks can only run after the obligation of the corporation to the extent of what assets are in the records of the corporation. Of course, including the equity funds that were contributed, because they will form part of the assets. But these obligations will have a limit, that is the maximum limit that the creditors can collect. And these debt funds will no longer cross the line. You notice there is no line here, there is a blue boundary. These particular creditors can no longer cross the line to collect any residual balance of the obligation of the corporation from the shareholders. The shareholders should be so independent that they will only be liable to the extent of the equity funds that they contributed here. Obviously, there's also a limit under our laws that when you have an obligation with your creditors, more especially your banks, you cannot withdraw any of your equity funds unless and until your obligations have been fully paid for. And so the corporation now having its total funds, who knows, can have 10 million, 4 million from the shareholders, and 6 million from the creditor banks. start now with the exercise of buying. Obviously, they will have to go into their business model, their strategy, where they will have their own machines, the materials, the formulation and methods by which they will combine their materials, labor, and overhead using their technology to the machines to produce a finished product. Their marketing organization will go to the customer to push that product with a particular price that will attract the potential buyer, with the distribution of the product so that the rational distributors and the dealers can help out in positioning the product to, closer to the ultimate customers, the advertising and promotions, and obviously the people who will be running the entire organization to generate profits. And so these people, this kind of business model will now enter into the buy-sell process. And so out of the buy-sell process, obviously, the organization is expected to have a higher selling price than buying price, and therefore should generate a profit that it can allow the profit to be declared as dividends income in favor of the owners, and to also pay, the interest income to the bankers so that they will have a happy situation. There you are. The major feature of a corporation is that it has limited liability. Okay. Sinadya po natin yan just for you to remember the main feature of a corporation is to allow the businessman to organize it for business and at the same time save on bankruptcy by limiting the liability of the corporation. Moving now. Here, we talk about the separate entity theory. Let's see whether moving this again to this level will help us out. The separate entity theory says that, and we are quoting here some decisions of the Supreme Court as early as 2017, International Academy of Management and Economics versus Lytton, Saragossa versus Emperador Distillers, Veterans Federation versus Montenejo, YI Leisure versus U and U versus NLRC. The Supreme Court had the opportunity to emphasize that the corporation has a personality separate and distinct before the law. And the separate and distinct personality is purely a creation of law. And so that therefore, the state can likewise either withdraw the charter of a corporation if it is not serving the purpose for which the charter was given. Continuing now, it says that the continued existence of a corporation is assured even if the corporation changes its ownership. It is the area of succession happening in the segment of the stockholder owners. It says the continued existence of the corporation is not affected by any change of its ownership due to the transfer of shares of a stockholder to third persons. And change in the ownership of PNB, for example, which is majority owned by the government, to the private investor Lucio Tan, did not dissolve the old PNB and created the new PNB. It is the same PNB, except one, the original one is government-owned, and so it became a government-owned and controlled corporation. But because the shares of stocks are capable of being sold to outside stockholders, Lucio Tan offered to buy out PNB, and so PNB has become a private sector banker. Continuing now. it also says that the critical advantage, and we have already mentioned this a while ago, the critical advantage of separate entity concept. The first advantage that it has is, of course, the issue of limited liability. That was the original benefit of a corporation. That instead of a businessman being engaged as a single proprietor or a partnership where his personal assets are exposed or any other assets that he did not intend to be invested in a particular business endeavor. When the corporation was created, this businessman can decide out of his big chunk of wealth how much of his wealth he will invest in a venture that he expects to be more profitable for his wealth to build up there, the allocated wealth. However, he is aware that there is a safety, buffer for him if he were to organize his business as a corporation. That the corporation can engage in borrowing money, it can sell, it can contract. And if in the process of buying and selling, it incurs liabilities, it is that corporation that is liable to the creditors, whether they are bankers or suppliers, and the liability will not extend beyond the corporation. So that is one advantage of the separate entity concept of a corporation. It has limited liability. But lately, the aspect of succession in a perpetual corporate existence seems to have a stronger appeal insofar as the corporation is concerned. As you know, individual proprietorship, the owner dies and his business dies. In the case of partnerships, the resignation or the death or departure of one partner dissolves the partnership. But a corporation, and we will discuss this in a little while, has the power and strength of succession. And the succession ranges from the shareholders to their own senior management and even to the rank and file employees. And so the atmosphere of a family corporation will no longer be a dominant factor to allow the corporation to continue forever its efficient operation, because it can continue to hire and rehire and develop and employ managers that would respond to the need of the corporation, even if these managers are not owners or stockholders, that they are being hired to perform their managerial and technical expertise, and they get paid for doing that, regardless of how much do they demand for their services. But they are not part of ownership. And so the succession and turnover of ownership can happen independent of the succession and turnover of senior management teams in the corporation. Although normally in family corporations, they are either running the corporation or they have people whom they trust to run the corporation. So now let's look at the separate entity concept with limited liability. The major drawback for the investor's propensity to release his invested money for business ventures is that risk, the danger that his entire properties can be wiped out in the event of the business loss, leaving him bankrupt. We keep on coming back to that because that's the major shortfall of a businessman attempting to enter into business. And finally, in the separate entity concept with limited liability, the corporation was designed as a legal entity, separate and distinct from its shareholders. And in principle, the debts of the corporation cannot be the personal obligations of the stockholder or stockholders. Hence, His properties cannot be attached in the event of corporate failure. Let us revisit two evolving concepts on how a corporation as a separate entity came into existence. This is borrowed from Professor Stephen Padfield, Journal of Constitutional Law, and speaking out of the School of Law of the University of Akron. And let us take a look at these two side-by-side concepts of a corporation, the contract theory and the process theory. Under the contract theory, we learned that the state recognized the corporation as a means to benefit the people by way of the socio-economic structure for sustained growth in resources and wealth for the people. In simple language, ang sinasabi natin dito, nirecognize na ang ating gobyerno, ang ating pamahalaan, ang ating estado, ang isang korporasyon. At nakita ng ating pamahalaan na kung sosolvein yung issue ng takot ng mga may-ari ng kapital, na mawala yung kapital nila kung magkakautang-utang sila sa business, ang binigay ng estado, ng state is, bibigyan kita ng legal mechanism na artificial being ito before the law, may karapatan nito. Siyempre, ikaw ang kikilos para magkaroon siya ng katawan para kumilos. Dahil artificial being siya. Pero kung meron siyang ikokontratang utang, yung utang na yon para sa korporasyon, hindi para sa inyo ng mga stockholder niya. Hindi kayo general partnership of a corporation. Second, the corporate charter, the state issues represents a contract between and among. So yung charter, no, yung certificate of incorporation na binigay ng SEC, no, in favor of a registered corporation, actually is a contract. And that contract is between and among these segments of society. Number one, it is a contract between the state and the corporation. Kaya nga mayroong corporation code, may mga provisions, yan ang ating terms and conditions para tayo umandar. Second, the charter of a corporation is also the contract between the corporation and its stockholders. Kung separate tayo, kami yung stockholder na nagbigay sa iyo ng kapital at ikaw pala under the law hiwalay, dapat meron tayong intindihan kung ano ang ating relationship. Saan tayo dapat magkakampi at saan tayo medyo alanganin kung tayo magkakampi. So there will be a contract, and usually the contract is governed by the articles of incorporation followed by the bylaws. No? And then among the stockholders, ganun din, articles of incorporation and bylaws. That is the contract theory of a corporation. In the process theory of the corporation, here is what our friends tell us. The process theory views the corporation as a mechanism where inputs of capital, money, services, managerial and technical with methods and raw materials are combined to produce products and services with a strong market clientele. Now, moving now to the issue of separate entity concept and corporate succession. Basic management principle adheres to the concept that no one in any organization is indispensable. A deep bench in a corporate strength, which some organizations have achieved, and so that therefore, an organization that has a hierarchy of very competent and committed people can allow the organization to function like a sharpened army, a sharpened fighting force. And the depth or non-availability of certain people at the higher levels would not hurt so much the organization as they would have subordinates and people available to take over their shoes. Yun ang sinasabing deep bench and no one being indispensable. Corporations like this have accepted the reality that people are finite. Mamamatay sila, mawawala sila, magre-resign sila, or what have you. Hihina na rin siguro ang kakatawan nila pag nag-retire sila. Hindi po pwede na dala-dala nila yung kapasidad nila para patakbuhin yung korporasyon at sila lang. There has to be a set of co-workers, no? Normally mga subordinate managers nila who have also learned along the way and can take over their position at any time. The multinational American, Japanese, and European companies have a systematic turnover of their corporate leadership worldwide. Masyadong advanced yung mga Americans, even yung mga Japanese and European companies, in all sectors, no, pharmaceutical, electronics, anything. They will have a battery of managers in a hierarchical structure. And since they operate worldwide, they give their evolving managers, their managers who are growing, the opportunity also to become initially managers of their subsidiaries all over the world. That's why you can see, for example, in the Philippines, you will have Procter & Gamble PMC, Unilever PRC, in the consumer business. You can have the banks, Citibank, and all the other multinational banks, Standard Chartered, putting country managers and vice presidents in the Philippine subsidiary in order for them to learn how to manage a certain operation in an offshore subsidiary like the Philippines. So they learn by doing the job themselves. And after they've been able to do that, then they move also to other organizations so that ultimately after their series of foreign assignments, they ultimately get promoted to head office, and in headquarters, head office, they're able to understand and they can react because they have been all over the world and have run the operations frontline. Those that are even smarter, and I've worked with them, are the Japanese. In the Japanese management culture, there is no such thing as a marketing man, a finance man, an engineer, and so on. No. From the point of view of the Japanese, any Japanese employee, any Japanese manager should be able to accept assignments that may not have been their original training. So an engineer, a Japanese engineer, can be asked to perform, for example, human relations functions. Or he can be asked to study, so to become the chief finance officer of his own company. In the same way as a Japanese executive who was training his finance and accounting can be moved on to marketing in order for him to learn. So that in the Japanese culture, the well-rounded training is achieved in that when any Japanese superior officer retires or passes away, there will be a battery of equally qualified junior officers who have also taken an assignment in all the functions of marketing, manufacturing, and finance to be able to assume the leadership as the chief finance officer. Now, obviously, that is also true for European companies. I also noticed the Korean companies follow the Japanese model, but I have not worked with the Koreans to be able to appreciate how they do it. Management performance expectations in these multinationals hinge along predefined corporate objectives, updated strategic plans, and financial budgets. Replacement of senior and middle management executives seldom disrupts the more systematically driven organizations. Local Filipino companies have different experiences in corporate succession, such as, for example, in the case of Henry C's SM, in the case of John Gokongwei's JG Summit, and the MCI of David Consigny, their organizations have managed to keep the family shareholdings intact because the subsequent generations have effectively taken over with competence on the key functions of their family-owned corporations. Perpetual corporate existence is made possible by family succession through generations. Now, corporations with publicly held shareholdings have mixed corporate evolutions. San Miguel Corporation under Danding Cojuangco and Ramon Ang, MV Pangilinan for PLDT, Makati Med, and Meralco and Channel 5, and ABS-CBN under the third generation Lopezes are interesting corporate evolutions. It will be interesting, for example, to note that in the case of San Miguel was traditionally under Andres Soriano, already a progressive organization, was essentially focused on San Miguel beer and with its line extenders. But San Miguel also went into an area that is not exactly along the lines of beer. And this is in the area of poultry products. And so San Miguel came into the poultry business. That's why you have Magnolia Chicken and Dress Chicken, and they have their farms under, of course, the leadership of then Andres Soriano. And they have also, of course, their ice cream brand, Magnolia. I already mentioned Magnolia poultry products, but Magnolia ice cream has always been leader for quite some time until the other brands also started coming in to threaten them. Among them is, of course, the empire of John Gokongwei. Now, they also had some line extenders, like San Miguel became very dominant in the packaging industry with their Parola plant, that they essentially monopolize two major packaging products. One of them is the bottles, and the San Miguel beer bottles obviously is a bottleneck when Lucio Tan tried to enter the beer market with Beer na Beer. And the strategies of Lucio Tan were very smart to identify that unless they have their own bottle making factory, they will not be able to topple San Miguel beer. And so they themselves, Beer na Beer, established their own glass plant. And along that line also, San Miguel started its corrugated cartoon product line, which essentially was dominating not only the amber bottles from the pharmaceutical companies, but also the boxes for the medicines that are ultimately delivered to Mercury and to the rest of the drugstores all over the Philippines. San Miguel was already exciting at that particular stage. But when Danding Cojuangco and Ramon Ang entered into the picture, that was the San Miguel build-up as a conglomerate did not stop. The most recent one is the entry of San Miguel into the infrastructure construction business, where they built that skyway that is linking South Luzon and North Luzon. And that is in the area of construction. And so San Miguel has never been in the construction industry until it decided to enter into that market. Even before that, San Miguel Corporation was smaller than ESO or even Mobile or Caltex or Shell. But after a while, after the evolution of ESO, a Rockefeller subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey, selling out to the government corporation Philippine National Oil Company, no? PNOC. And PNOC developed Petron into the #1 oil company in the Philippines. After a while, when Geronimo Velasco was no longer calling the shots in PNOC and Petron, San Miguel ultimately offered to buy out Petron. And so ESO, which became Petron, from an American subsidiary of the #1 oil company in the world, no, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Exxon, became a Filipino corporation and the dominant corporation in the person of Petron for the domestic market. And now, suddenly, Petron is under the wings of San Miguel Corporation. And so this is the kind of evolution that San Miguel has shown, with diversification in a lot of other areas. Initially under Andres Soriano, and even more aggressive and diversified under Danding Cojuangco and Ramon Ang. A beautiful lesson in evolution and also succession insofar as San Miguel is concerned. There is also succession because Andres Soriano sold out his shares to Danding Cojuangco, and so that therefore that did not disrupt. The succession was successful in that it did not disrupt the structure of San Miguel Corporation. Now, Manny Pangilinan is another maverick in this whole ballgame of corporate succession. Before Manny Pangilinan came into the picture, PLDT was essentially a Tony Boy Cojuangco and Yuchenko empire. And PLDT had difficulties trying to service the public that allowed definitely a market for the cell phones, initially Piltel, which was also PLDT, and Extelcom. This is in the analog cell phone technology until it moved to digital that got Smart and Globe coming in. Now, under that particular setup, PLDT was struggling until somewhere along the line, Manny Pangilinan came into the picture to assume leadership of PLDT. And while PLDT has not definitely overcome its centuries-old problem, if you may, PLDT, of course, starts picking up and is able to move on with the technology headed by Pangilinan, who also is running Smart. And on the other side, Globe, suddenly the Ayala Group entered this particular market with Globe becoming the frontline participant in the cell phone business. Pangilinan also entered a very unique market, the hospital administration market. Makati Medical was not making as much money when it is a profit center compared to a non-profit center like St. Luke's. St. Luke's is supposedly owned by a religious corporation, was making profits when it's not supposed to be because it's a non-profit organization. And Makati Medical, a profit center, was losing a lot of money. Well, it's a long story, but when Manny Pangilinan came in and started revitalizing the management of Makati Medical, now Makati Medical is making money and somewhere also allowed the expansion of its facilities. Well, Manny Pangilinan is faced with Meralco and also Channel 5. And that would be interesting challenges. But the more interesting one, a giant in the media business, is ABS-CBN. Because ABS-CBN have been for centuries, if I may exaggerate, been the dominant, player in the initially radio and later on television. And you have two generations of Lopezes, the original Eugenio Lopez Sr., and then later on the son, which was overtaken by martial law. And now, after things have normalized, the third generation Lopez, this is Gabi Lopez, took over. But somewhere, somehow, they were not able to manage their political linkages that ABS-CBN has lost its franchise today. Very interesting story in corporate succession of corporations with separate entities. Just a side comment here. While the corporation has been invented precisely to manage the risk on investors on bankruptcy because of debt exposure. Essentially, the creation of the limited liability concept in corporations. Banker creditors have been able to go around it in order to circumvent the corporate protection that was offered. And among the multinationals, when the banker creditors would offer their credit facilities, in order to avoid the impact of limited liability, the banker creditors in the Philippines, BPI, RCBC, PS Bank, Metro Bank, and of course the multinational banks, Citibank and Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Chartered Bank, would be able to circumvent the limited liability rule for corporations by requiring multinationals to ask for their head office to issue a head office guarantee. And because many of these many of these banks have correspondence relationships, if they're not multinationals like Citibank, the head office guarantees can be negotiated even offshore. And there are even times when, in addition to head office guarantees, the bankers would require the opening of standby letters of credit to answer for all of these debt obligations. On the other hand, in the case of Filipino borrowers, and notably if they are family-owned or controlled corporations, there is this so-called JSS signatories, meaning the members of the family who control the corporations are required by the creditor bankers to execute, in effect, a joint surety, making them primarily liable for corporate obligations as a condition for the approval of the loans. And so, just like our issue on negotiable instruments where the, what do you call this, the circulation of the check as a medium of exchange has been curtailed by the reason of limited second endorsements. The same is true now that the corporation can no longer effectively avail of the benefit of limited liability simply because the bankers have been able to go around it either to head office guarantees or to the joint and several signatures, a surety agreement between the major stockholder and the local corporation. So that therefore, if we try to rationalize the benefit of a corporation, what is now evolving is the corporate succession feature of corporations being a stronger attraction than the limited liability. Here is just a sharing of succession among shareholders. We already worthwhile to mention, for example, in the area of succession among shareholders is the ESO Petron evolution. Jeronimo Velasco converted a formidable American oil subsidiary, that is ESO, into the #1 leadership in the petroleum industry, taking over the Rockefeller Company into a successful government-owned corporation. Petron has evolved to be the strongest oil company in the Philippines and is now part of the San Miguel conglomerate. The second very interesting succession by shareholders is the Philippine National Bank. Philippine National Bank was a government-owned giant in banking, handling the sugar industry until Lucio Tan bought out the government and became its controlling shareholder. So San Miguel, PNB, being a government bank, has evolved by shareholder succession into a domestic private bank without affecting PNB as a corporation. The third one that is interesting to take note of in terms of succession by shareholder is BDO, which consolidated PCI Bank, Equitable Bank, and Banco de Oro. SM Senricis Group managed to integrate Equitable PCI Bank with its smaller Banco de Oro, making BDO now the leading commercial bank. BDO continues to remain as the same corporation, while Equitable PCI Bank lost their identities. In the area of corporate management succession, organizational succession in many well-managed companies and their capacity to hire on their own professional managers to achieve results is a strong feature of a corporation. Family corporations or even partnerships will find it difficult to pirate good people from other corporations. But in the interest of strengthening its management teams, under the principle of succession in corporate management, then good managers can be hired and pirated by competitors. And finally, in succession, organizational succession, here is where dependable and result-driven employees, even at the rank-and-file level, can be trained and promoted to sustain a functioning organization. I remember very clearly that I was then with ESO, where in 1973-74, when we were acquired by PNOC. And the agreement between ESO and PNOC is that the middle managers of PNOC, notably of ESO, notably the supervisors, will not be allowed to avail of any retrenchment program. It was because Petron or PNOC recognized that the strength of ESO was in its supervisory rank. That a supervisor in ESO is trained to decide, and everybody moves to the supervisory level only after showing that he has the necessary technical experience, capability, and managerial capacity to make decisions at the operational level. And PNOC was correct in that particular regard, and that was the backbone of how Petron ultimately bulldozed Caltex and Shell to become #1 in the market. Moving now to one of the more interesting subject matter in corporation is the so-called piercing the veil of corporate fiction. And this is very misleading by impression, because when you talk about piercing the veil, somewhere on there gives a connotation that is sexual, in that it is like piercing the veil of a virgin. No, in other words, there is a virgin, and you try to, like a Arabian girl with all of those facial coverings, you pierce her veil in order to get her virginity. Somewhere along the line, over the years, the choice of piercing the veil is not really descriptive of what you are trying to do by way of trying to catch fraud using the corporate concept as a means of committing fraud. And so we review again what we said about the state granting a charter to form a separate legal and distinct entity, the corporation. So it is the state. And right now, through the Securities and Exchange Commission, a group of businessmen or even one businessman can aspire to be recognized as a corporation by applying to be granted a charter. The separate legal structure can be set aside. This is the critical thing now. When the corporation is not being used to serve its socio-economic design but for a wrongful purpose, then the wrongdoer can be made liable under the doctrine of piercing the veil of corporate fiction. Let me again refocus our attention here, because it is very important now to understand that the reason why government allowed the existence of a separate and distinct legal entity called the corporation is initially to help the businessman in the danger of bankruptcy by limiting the liability of the corporation only to a certain amount, which is its own liability, and not cross the boundary to run after the owner of the corporation. That is the main essence. And the substance is to release, the propensity of investors to put their money in business ventures. And since they can borrow 60% of their 40% contribution, in other words, if they contributed a certain amount of money, they can expand that by borrowing the balance of 60% to make it a 40-60 combination of debt to equity. And so the government says that, go ahead, invest in this, and I will give you your limited liability privilege. You operate that corporation as if it is distinct and separate, and that will allow you, because you have now the authority to enter into contracts, to use that corporation to borrow 60%. So if you're putting up, for example, 4 million, you can borrow 6 million to create your 10 million capitalization, so that in effect, you are able to leverage, you're able to expand the equivalent operational value of your 4 million to 10 million. So that is our reason for creating a corporation. Now, here is the catch. If for some reason, some of those who are part of the corporation do not use the corporation for that purpose, they use the corporation to commit fraud, pandaraya, panloloko sa public. And then pag-ahabulin sila, sasabihin nila, hindi kami yan ang gumawa niyan yung korporasyon, di korporasyon ang ihabla nyo. Government says that since the corporation was established for a definite purpose to benefit the socio-economic welfare of the nation, the people, and even the government. If the corporation is being used now, not anymore because of that, but for purposes of fooling other people by committing fraud, dishonesty, in effect, taking away their money using the corporation, the government is now saying, you are protected by the mantle, the mosquito net of this corporation against collection of monies that you use for purposes of your corporate business. But if you got money from outside and you use the corporation and you hide under that mosquito net, under the principle of piercing the veil of corporate fiction, I will lift that particular mosquito net in order to arrest you, in order to make you liable, because you are not to use that corporate mosquito net to hide from nefarious activities of fooling other people and committing fraud. Yun ang principle ng piercing the veil. Parang yung korporasyon, siya ay mosquito net to protect the good businessman so that he can function and create, value for his venture with only 40% capitalization. Pero kung ang gagawin pala, either siya o may mga tao siya na kinuha, no, na nandun sa ilalim ng korporasyon, pero ang ginagawa nanloloko, no, nagnanakaw, gumagawa ng drugs, whatever, all the illegal acts. And then they will say, hindi ho kami yan Kami ang gumagawa ho niyang korporasyon. Pero hindi mo makakagawa ng korporasyon, taong gumagawa nun. Sasabihin ng gobyerno, teka muna, aangatin ko muna itong mosquito net, corporate mosquito net, para mahuli kita, para ma-prosecute kita. That is the essence of piercing the veil. Kaya hindi po talaga pinupunit yung veil. Because the figurative speech of piercing the veil creates a wrong impression that you have already destroyed the corporation. That once you pierce the veil, the corporation has already been de-virginized. Hindi na siya yung dating korporasyon na parang siya yung dating virgin na siya hindi na virgin ngayon. Hindi po ganun ang concept ng piercing the veil. Kaya nga mali yung pagkakagamit ng piercing the veil. Ang dapat po, lifting the corporate mosquito net para mahuli mo yung gumagamit ng corporate mosquito net to hide their fraudulent activities. Ayan. And so, what are the three instances under the why does I leisure versus you, a 2015 Supreme Court decision, when the corporate veil or among ourselves, the corporate mosquito net can be lifted? Okay, number one. Okay, tatlo na kagad sila. When the separate and distinct corporate personality defeats public convenience. Yan. Ginagamit yung corporate umbrella, corporate mosquito net to defeat public convenience. Like trying not to pay one's personal obligation, pretending that it is corporate obligation, and therefore habulin mo sa korporasyon na yan na wala ng pera. Second, very distinct is in fraud cases, or to justify wrong, protect a fraud, or defend a crime. Basta, napaka-importante. Yung korporasyon, inimbento yan na idea na separate legal entity para tulungan yung businessman initially doon sa kanyang exposure sa utang. And now, to assure him of of continuing succession, no? Perennial life ng kanyang korporasyon. Pero the moment gamitin yung korporasyon na yun, lalo na sa panloloko, then the corporation itself is not the one acting, because that corporation can only be used for something that is good, honest, and right. So the moment that corporation is used for fraud, then that corporate umbrella, that corporate veil, that corporate mosquito net could not be used for that purpose. And so ililip mo lang yun, sabi mo, para wag magulo, huhulihin ka namin because you committed fraud. Or it is an alter ego case where a corporation is a mere conduit of another corporation in a corporate pyramiding scheme. Mga kaibigan, I would like to advance the concept dito sa alter ego, that the easier way to imagine it is, you are not allowed under the first and second premise, lalo na sa fraud, to commit fraud by using the corporate mosquito net. So, ang gagawin mo ngayon, no, pagka yung corporate mosquito net na yun, ginamit mo, tatanggalin. Okay. Anong ginawa? Gumawa ng maraming corporate mosquito net, no? Pinagpatong-patong, for example, no? 3, 4, 5, patong-patong. Kasi sabihin mo ngayon, ikaw gumagawa ka ng fraud. Sa makatwid, dapat tanggalin ko yung corporate mosquito net mo. Okay. So, ang ginawa niya, tinanggal niya yung corporate mosquito net. Okay. Pagtanggal niya, meron pa palang isang corporate mosquito net. No? Tanggal na naman siya. No? Pangatlo, meron na naman. So, kailangan may mo nakalima siya bago niya natanggal yung patong-patong na corporate mosquito net. Yung mga nasa ibabaw, yun ang tinatawag natin na alter ego corporations. And the ultimate objective, no, is pagpatong-patungin sila para kanwari nakatakip sila doon sa ultimate fraud. And in this particular case, you can now imagine yung corporate pyramiding, di ba? Nagbi-build up ng ito yung korporasyon na gagamitin sa frontline pandaraya. Pagkatapos palalabasin na ito pala, meron siyang mother corporation, meron pa siyang mother corporation, or merong mother corporation, tapos gagawa ng subsidiary. Tapos yung subsidiary ang nandadaya. Pagka hinuli yun, sasabihin, hindi, korporasyon mo kami. Tsaka hindi ho kami nag-utos niyan. Yun yung stockholder namin. Korporasyon din. Diba? Yun na naman palusot. No? So in that particular case, the Supreme Court, in effect, if you read through the alter ego decisions, no, medyo complicated. And so I tried to simplify it by saying, yung alter ego, in effect, yun ang scheme ng pyramiding to cover up the fraud in a series of overlaps. So, in that particular case, hindi na iisa-isahin ng legal system yung pagtanggal ng corporate mosquito. Sabay-sabay na niyang tatanggalin, sabihin, huli ka sa yung fraud at pinagtakpan-takpan mo pa na ano. In fact, ang proof na manloloko ka, gumagamit ka nga ng alter ego concept na pinagpatong-patong mo yung mosquito net na wala naman talagang function kung di takpan, no, in layers yung fraud na ginagawa mo at the grassroots. Okay. Ang ganda, ano po? If we really come to think about the whole concept. Now, piercing the veil of corporate fiction. Subukan natin ilagay dito sa medyo itaas ng konti para nababasa natin, no? Corporate charter to limit personal liability for corporate debt. Iyon ang isang principle. Now, when you organize a corporation, have it registered by following the prescription of the Securities and Exchange Commission. That particular corporation was originally designed to limit the personal liability of the stockholders, that the debts of the corporation can only be the obligations payable by the corporation. It cannot be passed on as the liability of the stockholders. Iba yun. Second, in the case of piercing the veil of corporate fiction, you can compare it with a partnership. Sa partnership, pag walang agreement, lahat sila general partner. Pag may utang yung partnership, silang lahat may utang. No? Either solidary and therefore hati-hati sila. No? Isa pwedeng magbayad ng lahat pero paghahati-hatian nila. Yun ang concept ng general partnership. Ngayon, hindi po pwede sa isang partnership na walang isa na ultimately siyang taya. Dapat parating may isang general partner na siya ang sasagot lahat ng obligation ng partnership. Pagdating sa corporation, wala yung equivalent na yun ng general partner. In the case of a corporation, the stockholders would subscribe and in effect make their contribution to the capital of the corporation. That capital will stay there for as long as the corporation is functioning. They cannot withdraw that either by way of a redemption of their shares or by asking that they be given dividends in order for them to indirectly recover their investment. They cannot take back their investment for as long as there is an outstanding obligation to a third-party creditor. So yun ang limitasyon sa korporasyon. They cannot withdraw their capitalization. However, if the obligations have already been paid, then they can withdraw. They can draw their dividends, and at the same time, they can also avail of their appraisal right to withdraw from the corporation. Otherwise, hindi po pwede. Okay. Officers, directors, or stockholders who use the corporation for immoral evasion, for fraud. Ayan. So, it is the officers, the directors, or stockholders who are using the corporation for immoral evasion or for fraud. And because of that, it is not the corporation itself that is doing it. It is the individuals using the personality and name of the corporation when the corporation itself is not doing it. Now, next, piercing the corporate veil causes no harm nor injury to the corporation because the fraud was committed by another person outside of the corporate responsibility. There is kasi a question, once you pierce the veil of corporate fiction, does the corporation exist? The answer is yes. If you try to understand my example na the concept of corporate veil is more of a concept of a corporate mosquito net. Na inaangat mo lang yung mosquito, yun ang tinatawag na kanwari piercing, pero actually lifting the corporate mosquito, hindi nasira yung mosquito net. Pagka nahuli na yung yung nag-commit ng fraud using as a disguise the corporate mosquito net, ibalik mo lang yung mosquito net, buo pa rin. Or ilagay mo na sa iba yung mosquito net, doon na kayo mag-operate as a corporation. Okay? So, the piercing the veil or the lifting of the corporate mosquito net never affects the legal status of the corporation because it is not a party to the fraud. Finally, corporate existence is not an issue. Yan ang sinasabi ko for fraud committed is not within the corporate franchise. Hindi yung korporasyon ang gumawa. So pag nagkaroon ng piercing the veil, hindi yung korporasyon ang nasasaktan. Kung hindi itinatabi yung korporasyon para nga hindi masaktan, para yung gumagamit sa korporasyon na nakakasakit ang hulihin. Now, we now move out of those discussion as we now move to classes of corporations. So we have two classes, stock corporation and non-stock corporation. The stock corporation are those with capital stock divided into shares and are authorized to distribute to the holders of such shares dividends or allotment of surplus profits on the basis of shares held. And non-stock are those that are not involved with any capital stock. Corporations by special law or charter, there are government-owned or controlled corporations created by special laws or charters, and they are governed by their special laws or charters, creating them or applicable to them. Very seldom are private corporations organized by special law or charter of Congress. Now, what are corporators, incorporators, and stockholders? You have corporators in stock corporations, they are the stockholders and shareholders. In non-stock corporations, in non-stock corporations, the corporators are the members. What are incorporators? Incorporators are the stockholders and shareholders in a stock corporation, and in non-stock corporation, they are members. So they're the incorporators, and they originally formed composed and are the signatories in the articles of incorporation. What are the classification of shares? You have your non-voting shares and your voting shares. However, it is very important that no share may be deprived of voting rights except those classified and issued as preferred shares or redeemable shares. So all shares are supposed to be voting unless they are in the articles of incorporation identified as preferred or redeemable. The vote required to approve a particular corporate act refers to the stocks with voting rights. Only those that have voting rights will be given the option to vote for certain issues requiring stockholders' approval. Here, there shall be a class or series of shares with complete voting rights. Para sa partnership, parating may general partner. Sa corporation, there should always be one class of shares that are always with complete voting rights. In the absence of any indication, common shares are always with complete voting rights. Now, the other classification of shares is no par value shares and par value shares. However, banks, trust companies, insurance and training companies, public utilities, building and loan associations, and other corporations authorized to obtain or access funds from the public, whether publicly listed or not, shall not be permitted to issue no par value shares. Okay. Classification of shares. Holders of non-voting shares shall be entitled to vote on the following. Ayan. Tinawag mo silang non-voting pero boboto pa rin sila in the following issues. Amendment of the Articles of Incorporation. Increase or decrease of authorized capital stock. Adoption and amendment of bylaws. Merger or consolidation of the corporation with another corporation or other corporations. Sale, lease, exchange, mortgage, pledge, or other disposition of all or substantially all of the corporate property, investment of corporate funds in another corporation or business in accordance with the Corporation Code, incurring, creating, or increasing bonded indebtedness, and the dissolution of the corporation. So that even if you are a non-voting share, like you are a preferred share, the moment any of these 8 issues are the subject matter of resolution by the 2/3 vote of the stockholders, then you have the right to vote and you can insist on your right to vote. Public versus private corporation. A public corporation is a government-owned or a government-controlled corporation created by special charter. Yun yung nabanggit kanina. Public corporation yun. There is no difference between the term original charter and special charter. And a private corporation is a corporation created under a general law. And the general law is the Corporation Code of the Philippines. Kung is a public corporation, it is a public corporation performing public service and supplying public funds. So public corporation yun, pero nagre-render ng public service and supplying public funds. Government-owned or controlled corporation, preferred shares. The preference of preferred shares can either be in dividend distribution, in the distribution of corporate assets in liquidation, and other preferences. The preferred shares of stock may be issued only with a stated par value. Stated par value. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the last 3 shares are specialty shares that we call it, for example, ang tawag dito founder shares. The founder shares may be given certain rights and privileges not enjoyed by the owners of the stock. And that right is the exclusive right to vote and be voted for in the election of directors and shall not exceed 5 years from the date of incorporation. And the exclusive right shall not be allowed when it will violate the anti-dummy law, the Foreign Investment Act of 1991, and other foreign laws. Let me see if I can adjust this a little. It says redeemable shares. Their shares may be issued by the corporation when expressly provided in the Articles of Incorporation. They are shares which may be purchased by the corporation. Take note that the general rule is the corporation cannot redeem its own shares if there are still outstanding debt. However, the exception are redeemable shares. The redeemable shares are defined in the Articles of Incorporation as such redeemable shares. And so, the Articles of Incorporation does not contain any obligations because the corporation starts with only capital stock. And so, when the creditor banks issue loans to banks, to corporations, presumably, they have already reviewed the Articles of Incorporation and they have seen the presence of redeemable shares. So the bank's creditors cannot take an issue that there is an obligation to them when the redeemable shares are due for redemption. They are shares which may be purchased by the corporation from the holders of such shares upon the expiration of a fixed period, regardless of the existence of unrestricted retained earnings. The thing that I was trying to explain in the books of the corporation and upon such other terms and conditions stated in the Articles of Incorporation and the certificate of stock representing the shares subject to rules and regulations issued by the SEC. Let me re-emphasize that even if one restriction that is not doesn't become a restriction for redeemable shares to be paid back by the corporation is the existence of obligations to the creditors. The second one is even when there is no unrestricted retained earnings, the redeemable shares can still be redeemed because normally you cannot redeem any shares outstanding unless you have positive retained earnings. But the exception is when the shares to be redeemed are redeemable shares. Even if there is no restricted retained earnings, then the redemption can happen. The only exception is the redeemable shares cannot be redeemed if upon redemption the corporation will become bankrupt. Then the redemption cannot happen. Okay? I think that is so obvious that if you redeem but you become bankrupt, then you no longer exist. That will be a suicidal corporate act. And finally, treasury shares. Treasury shares are shares of stocks which have been issued and fully paid for, but subsequently reacquired by the issuing corporation through purchase, redemption, donation, or some other lawful means. Such shares may again be disposed of for a reasonable price fixed by the board of directors. So they are originally unissued shares. Then there were subscriptions that were made on them, and so they were issued and outstanding. For some reason, the corporation with positive retained earnings can repurchase them either through the stock market or directly from the subscribers. But the intention is, at the time of repurchase, they are not intended to be retired or to be retired because the acquisition price of the treasury shares may be a little low. And by withdrawing it from the stock market and put it in your treasury, actually in your vault, the number of shares in the market may tend to go down and therefore may jack up the price of your stock. And so you play with the law of supply and demand. When the stock market goes up, you release now the treasury shares at a higher market than purchase price. all the proceeds of the sale of treasury shares will become your additional paid-in capital. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is our first part of the revised corporation code, where we talk about the concepts, definitions, and classifications, and we zeroed in with more refinement on the separate entity theory, and we explain why the corporation was in the first place recognized by the state charter, and what is the nature of piercing the veil. And it is not really piercing the veil in the real sense. It is really lifting the corporate mosquito net in order to catch the person committing fraud in the name of the corporation. And so with this, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to temporarily close our first part, and we will therefore proceed to the second part in the next module, where we will talk about incorporation. Thank you very much. Marami pong salamat as we try to get off initially our recording.